August 6, 1945. The world's first atomic bomb is detonated over Hiroshima. The story of the making of the atomic bomb, the people involved, and its devastating effects have all been well documented. But few realize where in 1942 the Manhattan Project came looking for the Western world's only proven source of uranium. Or where over 60 years later, the worldwide awakening nuclear renaissance is returning for more. Shanghai, China, home to the world's fastest growing economy, and 7 of the world's 10 most polluted cities. China is reliant upon often unlicensed coal mines to feed power stations for approximately 70% of its energy needs. But this is set to change. To fuel its growing economy, China is forging ahead with its ambitious plans to harness the power of the atom. 32 new nuclear power plants over the next 15 years have been scheduled, more than doubling its reliance on the controversial source. Japan as well is going nuclear, with 5 more nuclear power plants scheduled to be built by 2010. Together, Japan and China are leading the world into a new nuclear renaissance that is being embraced by some unlikely allies.
My old colleagues in Greenpeace thinks that we can phase out both fossil fuels and nuclear energy. Where are they going to get the electricity? And then they start talking about solar panels, and my eyes glaze over, because that isn't a logical or feasible thing to do. I'm in the camp that believes that if we actually want to make a serious reduction of fossil fuel consumption for electricity, the only practical solution is a combination of renewables and nuclear.
We've seen now 11 utilities in the United States actively licensing sites for new reactors. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the U.S. is actually anticipating some 26 applications for reactors. And of course, they're quite worried about clean air and Kyoto. And it really ultimately caused them to conclude that maintaining their nuclear supply at about 50% is a good idea.
The problem we have is that there's so much coal in the world, and it's also possible to produce electricity relatively cheaper with coal than it is with nuclear energy. So countries like the United States, 60% of their electricity is from coal. China, 70% of their electricity is from coal. Australia, 90% of their electricity is from coal. And this is repeated around the world in many areas. New Zealand, a country that you wouldn't expect to go to coal-fired power, is doing so because they have no choice. They've got no other source, and they're so anti-nuclear in New Zealand. They would rather build a dirty coal-fired power plant spewing CO2 into the atmosphere than they would build a nuclear plant that has no air pollution and no CO2 emissions, because they've got a culture of fear around everything atomic.
New York's Hard Assets Investment Conference is abuzz with talk of uranium.
With China and India joining the modern world, it's half the world's population. I figured that they would need energy of all kinds, and with the risks involved with fossil fuel and of course global warming and the possible disruption by terrorists, uranium would be the thing that they would have to go for, because the whole world will eventually go from fossil to fissile and from carbon-based to mineral-based. And there's enough uranium in the world for centuries to come.
The nuclear renaissance is turning to Canada, the largest producer and exporter of uranium in the world today. Northern Saskatchewan is referred to as the Saudi Arabia of uranium mining. It contains the richest uranium ore bodies in the world. Uranium grades here are at 23%, 100 times higher than the world average.
The Athabascan Basin presently dominates the uranium production in Canada. And to the north of it is the Thelon Basin, which is basically virgin. And the native Canadian tribes are just basically beginning to sell their rights to allow this mining to come in. And you're going to see a big opening in the Thelon Basin, and Alberta Star is leading the way.
The CEO of Alberta Star, Tim Copeland, is the brother of best-selling author Douglas Copeland, who also happens to be a major shareholder in the company. It has seen its stock price soar from 20 cents to almost $3, an increase of 1,500%, and has become one of the fastest-growing mining exploration companies in North America.
The age of fossil fuels is coming to an end, and what's going to keep the lights on? It's going to be uranium. With the resurgence in uranium prices and what we call the sort of the new renaissance, the exploration companies are getting significantly financed, particularly if there's uranium or a sniffer uranium in the area.
Driving the company's soaring stock price is speculation that the Saulteaux Dene First Nations will allow new uranium mining at an old abandoned mine, known to the Dene as Somba Cay, the money place. The abandoned mine sits on the eastern shores of Great Bear Lake, the 8th largest freshwater lake in the world. 265 kilometers to the west is the Saulteaux Dene village of Delaney, population 565, the only settlement on the gigantic lake.
It's a great sorrowful thing to talk about in my family. My first boy, he was about 3 years old. He died of cancer, right in Port Regan. After I moved to Yellowknife, I have a daughter, grade 12, he died in Yellowknife of cancer. My wife also died of cancer in Yellowknife. It could be all developed from Port Regan, staying too long, because we eat fish right around the mine. And steady, we could have some radiation in our body and that kind of life.
My second husband got the cancer, died with the cancer death.
We came in after the government spent approximately $7.5 million, and they released a report saying there was no long-term detrimental health effects to the area. I mean, all the radionuclides are in equilibrium, and we actually decided to move into the area once that report was released. So we were able to come in here and acquire the land package that we did, and then when the report indicated there were no long-term harmful effects here, we were able to seize on the opportunity. A lot of the standing issues that have never been addressed have been addressed now, and there's closure, and they can move on with that area. What happened there will never happen again.
The El Dorado mine at Port Radium began its life in 1930 with a strike from a prospector's pick. It broke the Belgian Congo's cartel price on radium, then a miracle cancer cure worth $70,000 a gram. When World War II broke out in 1939, El Dorado was shut down. Radium was reclassified as a non-essential mineral. But the fate of the abandoned mine soon changed dramatically. In 1942, it was nationalized and reopened by the Canadian government. Uranium, a valueless byproduct of radium refining, was suddenly in demand. The top-secret supply of El Dorado uranium was sold to the United States government to fuel the $2 billion Manhattan Project and its efforts to make the first atomic bombs. During World War II, the mine figured in the geopolitics of 3 continents, altering the world in the process and ushering the nomadic Dene into the nuclear age.
Sometime around 1928, some prospector, 2 brothers, one name was Gilbert, and then these brothers have discovered a wonderful rock, a queer rock. It was uranium, but at that time there was not much news about uranium. Scientists in the outside world believed that it might be important for the future. All Indian people from Delhi moved to Port Radium area to have the opportunity to get a few dollars from the workers, the white people. They bring it in by plane from Fort Smith, from Edmonton, miners to mine the place. And lots of prospectors came on their own. They thought they couldn't get rich around the land. Indians had the opportunity to sell meat. They sell mitts and mucklucks and snowshoes.
The Dene were eventually employed as ore transport workers by the federal government, hauling 45-kilogram burlap sacks of radioactive uranium ore along a 2,100-kilometer transportation network of rivers, lakes, and portages known as the Highway of the Atom. From present-day Fort McMurray, the ore was sent by rail to Port Hope, Ontario for refining. The Dene live in such a remote area of Canada that few knew that World War II had even started, never mind that they had unwittingly handled the ore that ended it. The mine closed down in 1960, the same year that the first Dene ore transport worker died of cancer.
I think there's ample document to show that the government knew the health effects of radiation very early on. I think they knew it in the 30s and the 40s. By 1950, everybody knew it. By, I think, 1945, Muller received the Nobel Prize for Medicine for pointing out the genetic effects. So it was not an unknown substance at the time of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing.
For each year that we have records of Delaunay Dene assisting in the transport of ore, we went back and looked at the records and tried to to be detectives, if you will, with respect to what happened.
Sena's consultants used a technique known as dose reconstruction to determine if 35 Dene ore transport workers had contracted cancers due to radiation exposure.
Given the fact that people were exposed 70 or 80 years ago, was there enough information to come up with reasonable estimates of what their doses were? We had to know for each year that ore was being transported what the grade of the ore means the percentage of uranium. The higher the percentage of uranium, the more radioactive the ore is. The other piece of the puzzle is, unfortunately, from the 30s through the 40s, there are essentially no radiation measurements. And so the radiation from a bag of ore on your shoulders, for example, we had to calculate using computer models.
While Sena's consultants were investigating potential health risks at Port Radium, the uranium mining industry was undergoing a boom, the likes of which hadn't been seen in 2 decades. The growing worldwide nuclear renaissance has fueled a dramatic rise in the price of uranium, from a low of $7 in 2000 to a high of over $47 a pound in 2006. Saskatchewan's Cameco, the world's largest uranium company, saw its revenue increase to $1.3 billion in 2005. The corporation was formed in 1988 when Eldorado Nuclear, the federal crown corporation that once owned Port Radium, was privatized.
There are some 400 junior exploration companies out there. 8 years ago, there were only a handful. So there's been a huge change driven by the recovery of the price of uranium, where now they're able to raise money in the public markets and go out and obtain property positions, spend money trying to find that next ore body. We know that over time, some of them will succeed.
Tim Copeland's Alberta Star was also on the rise.
We drilled a project 2 years ago, and pretty much all we got was high-grade uranium. And at that particular time, I had given my word to the First Nations that we wouldn't focus in on the uranium aspect of the drill campaign, because at that time it was an iron oxide copper gold. We never really gave it a second thought back then. But now uranium is at the forefront. People are taking a position now and acquiring properties that are potentially or prospective uranium properties, and they're going after them aggressively. In a bull uranium market, the funds are there to finance and seek out uranium, which is what we're doing. There's almost 15 million pounds of high-grade uranium mined up there, and some of it was some of the highest uranium ever mined on the planet. They got up to 82% pitch blende, over 1 meter, 2 meter valence. In that particular area, a lot of what most people consider waste is up there is everyone else's high grade. It really is that significant. We started this exercise, I think uranium was at $18, and it's now, as of today, $41.50 US per pound, and that's pretty significant. You're in what we call a super cycle, and it's like a vortex taking everything upward. You can't stop the work that's going on up there. And I think that the communities up there have come to terms that there's going to be a significant amount of progress going on up there, and they're going to change that area forever. We expect to find what we consider the granddaddies of all deposits, which is an iron oxide copper gold, what we call an Olympic Dam style deposit, or an elephant.
In Australia, the Olympic Dam mine is the world's largest copper uranium mine. Radioactive waste is stored in 75-hectare retention ponds with levees 30 meters high. The place will soon have the honor of having created one of the largest radioactive tailings dumps on Earth. More than 10 million tons of tailings are added every year to the 60 million tons already sitting on the surface. The mine's infamy stems from its thirst. Enormous quantities of water are used to process uranium, 75 million liters a day.
McInnes Lake was a bit of a disappointment because we weren't able to get permitted there. I think we had 6 out of the 7 First Nations groups were on side with us, but the land claims haven't been settled there, so it's very difficult. Unfortunately, in this market, we don't have the luxury of going through a 2 to 3 year consultation process because we don't have 2 to 3 years. So we switched horses. We went to the SOD 2. They'd settled their land claims. They were very easy to work with, very fair, and all they asked is that you consult with us. Uranium, ultimately turned around.
But for Alberta Star to be able to develop this property, they would have to get support from Delaunay and the Delaunay Land and Financial Corporation, headed by Leroy Andre.
Leroy is what I call the new generation. He has the Alberta sensibility about him. He's my odds-on favorite for the next chief for the Assembly of First Nations.
I think what Alberta Star has done from the onset is they've approached Delaunay and said, okay, well, this is your territory, your land, your resources, your environment, your water, your fish, your animals. How can we work with you? Can we work within the parameters that you've set out and have sold? And we're willing to make a deal. We've been quite concerned still about how these elders are dealing with their loss and how they're dealing with their grandchildren and their families. That issue hasn't been addressed yet, and they're still feeling the pain from their loss and from the transfer of the knowledge that should be happening with the grandfathers that could have been around and should have been around. Whether it was caused by poured radium or not, there's still a lot of people that died of cancer.
That is why my mind was so strong, thinking about a prophecy.
Before the first white man had ventured around poured radium, a Dene medicine man had a vision. He had seen men with pale skin going into a big hole in the ground near the outcrop of rock where he was camping. The strangers emerged with dangerous rocks and made a long stick out of them. The stick was loaded into a giant bird and dropped on people who looked like Dene but who lived far, far away. All these people burned and later died from this long stick. The prophet also warned his people not to travel in front of the outcrop, to drink the water or catch fish in the waters around the point. Those that did, he explained, would become sick and die. The story was so strange that it was shelved away, relegated to local folklore. It is only now that the meaning of the prophet's words are becoming clear.
Well, way back in the 70s, I would say, my grandfather was still around that time, and he used to go hunting and trapping and all that. But when he died I think in 74, he died of bone cancer, and I knew something was wrong.
When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, nobody made the connection to the prophecy. The Delaunay Uranium Committee was formed to investigate why so many of their elders were dying of cancer.
When we first brought the issue of cancer, where it's coming from and all that, we wrote a letter to the health department, I think, from Munich, telling them that there's there's something wrong here, that our people are, all the elders are dying of cancer. And we need more studies on it, where it's coming from, why, and all that. And they wrote back and said that then people have been smoking all these years, so it has to do with smoking. That was the answer we got back. Around that time, Andrew Nickeforig was here, so he came here and asked questions and wrote about what had happened.
I started to do some investigative work for the Calgary Herald and ended up producing a lengthy series on the highway of the atom in northern Canada. The article in the Herald broke the story about the contamination and the impact of the mine on the health of people living in Delaunay, as well as the impact of the mine on the health of white workers who worked at Port Radium. And what I found in looking through a number of documents in both the United States and in Canada was that the United States recognized that it exposed a lot of workers and a lot of Aboriginal folks to unnecessary dangers in uranium mining as part of the war effort, and let those dangerous conditions continue long until around the 1960s. The U.S. government came clean and said, look, we screwed up. We exposed all these people to radon. We shouldn't have done it, and we knew better, but we were concerned about scaring people off in the middle of the war, and we wanted to keep the mines in production. The Canadian government has never come clean on what happened at Port Radium. And after the story ran, I was amazed at the number of calls I got from white miners who had worked in Port Radium and who were all reporting health problems. I got many calls from widows who explained to me that their husbands have died of cancer. Uranium was mined and then it was transported and it worked all its way to Port Hope in Ontario. And wherever that uranium went, it left a messy legacy. This highway, so-called highway of the atom that the Canadian government established and supported, there were a lot of casualties on it. And the Canadian government has never looked at the casualty rates on this uranium highway.
Armed with the prophecy and emphasizing a connection between Port Radium and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Delaunay Uranium Committee sought to bring both national and international attention to their cause.
Well, I travelled to Hiroshima with a party of elders and representatives from the community, and they went all the way to Hiroshima to say to the Japanese people they're sorry. And they felt sorry that they were involved in the production of the atom bomb. They felt guilt and they felt sorry.
We heard about the problem of A-bomb, which people have really suffered. We, as an Indian, we share your sorrow, our sorrow, and we share that together. Everybody is your brother and sister, and as an Indian, we love each other. So therefore, I love you people, and I see you that you are my brother and sister. That is my general thinking as an elder.
It was just so fascinating to view something like the atomic bomb from a society, from a viewpoint of hunters and trappers. Their philosophy comes from generations, thousands of years, living very humble. When you live on the Arctic Circle, you really learn humility towards nature. I began to see it as the perfect symbol for the West and for our mastery over nature. We are gods. We've played God over nature. We play God over nature. I started to feel that the story of Delaunay had a real profound message for all of us. And the message was to regain that humility that's been lost in mankind towards our environment.
As international attention on Delaunay grew, committee members were invited to Ottawa to meet with federal ministers.
The federal government by that time had said, yeah, let's try it this way, because they were rather desperate. They had kind of reached the edge and they didn't know where to go. They were being threatened with possible lawsuit, and it was a lot of incendiary devices being thrown.
The result was the creation of a joint Canada-Delaunay uranium table to investigate possible environmental contamination and to assess potential health risks at Port Radium.
The Canada-Delaunay uranium table developed essentially a program of action. We called it Plan of Action. And that Plan of Action set out a 5-year program, which was costed out at approximately $6.5 million.
The scientists like to call it systematic speculation. You know, given everything we know, what's our best guess as to what may or may not have happened? Were they dying of cancer because of what happened at the mine? Or could they possibly be dying of cancer because they were heavy smokers and they were alcoholics? Nobody really knew, but the perception in the community was certainly that this mine killed a lot of people from cancer.
The story of the Dene ore transporters and non-Aboriginal miners' exposure to the effects of uranium mining would be shared by a group of people far away from Port Radium. The Delaunay Uranium Committee looked to the Navajo, 3,000 kilometers to the south, for possible answers.
The history of Navajo uranium miners goes back a long ways. 50 years later, the Navajos look at it to where that it brought nothing but lung disease, cancers, and many other various illnesses among the Navajo people. My father was one of the first 16 miners to die. He was only 46 years old when he died from lung cancer. Thousands of people have died from exposure, to the point where our leaders are more educated about the devastation of mining. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons why there was a law that was set in place to ban uranium mining.
In April 2005, Navajo Nation President Joe Shirley Jr. signed legislation that banned the mining of uranium on Navajo land, an area the size of New England, and encompassing parts of Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico.
Back here in the States, uranium killed many of us. It continues to kill many of us. Many of our elders, my medicine people have gone on because to the exposure of the dangerous radiation of the uranium ore. There are other ways of getting into economic development to get jobs, revenues for the nation, for families, for communities. Uranium is just one.
It took our fathers, and now the mothers that went through these camps, they're suffering the same illnesses, showing the same symptoms. We have birth defects, that we have young people that have contracted cancers. Our water systems are contaminated. Our beautiful mountains are scarred. The vegetation is contaminated. And all in all, it was not good.
On October 5, 1990, U.S. Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, which provided for compassionate payments to uranium miners, ore transport workers, and mill workers who contracted certain cancers and other serious diseases as a result of their exposure to radiation released in the early uranium mines.
Our leaders are compassionate for their people, and they have heard enough, they have seen enough damages. And I think the Dene from the north, their leaders, they need to have a heart for their people. They need to be role models, not to enact legislation that would allow mining. what's going to happen 10 years from now, what's going to happen 20 years from now, 30 years from now. You have to be, I think you have to be ignorant if you're not considering your generations yet to come, from the babies that are going to be born tonight, and for those that are elderly that are going to go back into the spirit world. You have to have so much respect for life. We only come around one time, and I think that this is very sacred. And I think the leaders need to be aware of, that life is sacred, that water is sacred, and their surroundings, environment, their food chain, they have to consider that sacred. And I don't think money and greed, it's not going to bring happiness. I think my message to the Dene people up north was that our government, even though it took a long time, they have cooperated with us. And I am not sure about the Canadian government.
We haven't heard a peep out of the Canadian government. The US government, in the time of Clinton, they actually compensated the Navajo and all mine workers in the States, the workers, the victims, and the families, because a lot of them were dead. And what they said was, we are sorry and we will compensate all those we knowingly harmed. And our government doesn't do that. It was the government who ran it, and the government who worked those people who've suffered and died. I spoke to a widow. She was extremely emotional, and she was a mine manager's widow. He just keeled over and died right up there. And she said the government would have been kinder if they'd put all of the miners, the white miners, against the wall and shot them. It would have been a kindness. It shames me. It shames me as a Canadian that we can't own up to our past mistakes. We took the money, we took the billions out of the mine, the government ran the mine, and the government ran with the money. And it seems they don't say they're sorry because they'll know there'll be a dollar sign coming on following up if they admit to any guilt. And so they stay silent.
The Canadian government is a promoter of uranium production and has been since the 1930s and 1940s. There are government agencies solely devoted to the production of uranium and the selling of CANDU reactors. As a consequence, the Canadian government hasn't been terribly interested in looking at the dark side of its activities or looking at the dark consequences of activities in uranium mining in northern Canada.
Those territories are quite uncertain about uranium mining, and you can understand why. They hear the mythology, they see the videos, they hear all of the stories from those that are opposed. Frankly, what we've been doing that has a much stronger impact is we've actually been bringing their leaders down to see our operations. Once they see how small they are, how well run they are, the comfort level of the employees, the pains we take from a safety perspective, a radiation perspective, an environmental perspective, they go away being quite comfortable with uranium development in the northern part of Canada, i.e. Northwest Territories and Nunavut. We are the largest employer of Aboriginals, First Nations people, commercial employer in Canada.
Alberta Star held a public meeting in Delaney on August 10, 2005. The word uranium did not appear in their written presentation. With Delaney's support, the Sahtu Land and Water Board granted Alberta Star a drilling license at Contact Lake near Port Radium 2 weeks before the government's final report was released.
Just given the amount of stress, given the amount of money, and the huge focus on the negative part of the uranium mining in that community, that the community would have allowed in Alberta Star to start again mining for uranium literally within 5 kilometers of the old Port Radium. I'm surprised that the community allowed that to happen.
September 6, 2005. 60 years and 1 month to the day since the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima. After months of delay, the Canadian government's final report on port radium is released.
The final report basically said that after all the work we did, which looked at reconstructing history, reconstructing what people did, how they worked, what they were exposed to, and then connecting that to what is currently known about cancer and cause of health issues related to radiation, the experts told us that no one could conclusively indicate whether any individual who had cancer could be attributed to their work related to the mine, related to the ore carrying or the transport of ore. The report confirmed that the environment was safe and clean. The fish were safe to eat, the water was safe to drink in the port radium area.
We had an integrated device that measured gamma radiation on a spot-by-spot basis, and that was integrated with a global positioning system. So we were able to produce maps on a fine grid with several 100,000 gamma monitoring locations. Out of our more than 100,000 measurements, less than 0.5% measured at waist height exceeded 770 microarc per hour.
I'm absolutely confident that we understand the radiation levels on the site, what they are today. We spent a great deal of effort and their work was peer reviewed. So I'm very surprised that with the suggestion that we don't know what the upper levels are on the site.
I don't think the Sene's report was itself misleading because they have to work within their engineering guidelines. But whoever set this up knew very well that there was no feasibility for traditional epidemiological study using current techniques. Any epidemiologist would tell you that you can't do modern epidemiology in a small community. So to do an expensive study of the feasibility was ridiculous. They decided that they would use cancer death as a criterion for the seriousness of the contamination, and that would be the number they would use as their research goal. They kind of forgot about all of the other health effects, although they were well known and they were known to the Canadian government. It was pretty well spelled out for them in official documents.
Dr. Bertel proposed a $30,000 blood study to Delaunay to determine whether community members had actually been harmed by radiation.
I thought it would be more direct and more efficient to do blood samples of the people as well as 24-hour urine analysis to find out if there was uranium in the body. It would have been simpler, more direct, and quicker, and cheaper, much cheaper, around $30,000, which is a pittance compared to what all these engineering firms take.
Scientists from the Federal Department of Health had agreed to fund Dr. Bertel's blood study, which was also supported by the Northwest Territories Medical Officer of Health. But Delaney's new negotiators rejected this blood study in favor of hiring an engineering firm to do the health studies and to investigate contamination at the site. The engineering firm was Senes Consultants, members of the Canadian Nuclear Association, a lobby group for nuclear energy and uranium mining.
There is no blood study done as part of this. There is no unique biological marker of radiation exposure, and especially exposure that occurred 50 years in the past. It is for if you're exposed in an accident at high rates of exposure, there are some markers, but they're eliminated from the body over time. I don't think anyone could conceive of a blood test that would be relevant for these people as it would relate to their exposures 50 or 60 years ago. A blood test would only help them understand current health status. The exposure we're looking at for these denny are what we classify as chronic, day after day, and they're not very different than the background exposure that we all receive from radiation in the ground or in the air or from outer space. The principal effect is cancer of various kinds. There are other smaller effects, but the reality is if you don't expect to be able to see cancer, more subtle effects would even be more difficult to see. We're quite convinced that almost all the radiation exposure is from external radiation. So there's nothing that's taken into the body and nothing that's stored in the body. The kind of exposure the gamma radiation is similar to X-rays. You go to a doctor for a chest X-ray and you stand in front of a machine and X-rays pass through your body and they leave a pattern on a photographic screen, but there's nothing retained in your body. So this is the kind of exposure that the ore transport workers would have seen. So at the time of the exposure, there might have been some cellular changes, possibly, but these are eliminated over time, and they certainly wouldn't be around 50 years later after the exposure.
I think it was meant to impress the native people that they had done an expert job and called in these prestigious firms and basically tell them that nothing was wrong, when I think it is wrong.
The final report, which I take it cost close to $7 million, is really a travesty on a number of fronts. It's very narrow in its scope. It only addresses the health issues of approximately 30 denny. It doesn't mention the health problems that the Navajo had in the Southwest in the United States. It ignores the whole fact that thousands of European workers were exposed to dangerous tailings and radon gas in the mine. It doesn't look at any of the broader issues. I mean, it's so narrow as almost to be useless. It keeps the whole issue narrowly confined to one place and makes sure that very few Canadians or very few Japanese or very few Americans will ever find out about this history. I'm not surprised by the fact that there's little or no opposition from the community in Delaney. And I think it's important for people outside of the country to recognize that a lot of issues in Northern Canada are resolved by buying people off. And the federal government does this on a routine basis. They have bought a lot of silence in Northern Canada on the issue of uranium mining.
A second drilling permit at Port Radium itself was granted to Alberta Star in the spring of 2006.
You know, there's the old saying, you know, those that never took a chance never had a chance. And we took that chance and we gambled and we won, and we're very fortunate.
They approached us and said, you know, well, any access and benefit agreement or any opportunity for us to work with you, we'll do that. You know, you have lodges out there, you have planes that you're partners with, you have choppers that you're partners with. If there's guys that want to work out there, then we'll send them out there. You know, we had some cooks out there, we had some camp attendants out there, and so right from the onset we had some benefit, and now we've signed an agreement here with Alberta Star that hopefully would benefit the community for the long run. And if there's any discovery with Alberta Star, hopefully the community would benefit from that.
I always was against development because of what had happened over there. We have to say no to the exploration coming. We're okay here as we are because we have a lot of fish, we have a lot of moose and caribou, and it's free. We can use that. We can survive because of that. Maybe the only time maybe you should say yes to exploration is when they are gone. I would stand in front of them to protect them as much as I can.
Over the years, we've asked the elders a lot of questions about Great Bear Lake and about the community and the future of our people. And one thing the elders have come back to us about the prophecies is that Illinois is going to be one of the last places where people come to, and that we would be a very powerful nation. And we truly believe that, so we had to make sure that we can prepare for that, and we can feel those impacts now because the amount of exploration that's happening on our land. We had to make sure that we foresee that and we plan for that as a corporation and as a community.